can y'all hear me okay? I kind of move around as I talk, and we don't have like a portable microphone, so just speak up. All right. I was hoping I'd get a couple of people in the room. I'm a little disappointed in the turnout, but go ahead and start. So my name is Richard Schneeman, first of all. Hello. On the internet, I go by Schneems. Some people think that's really hard to pronounce, so it's kind of like Schnauzer or Schnapps, perhaps. I really love Ruby so much. In fact, oh wow, I'm totally off. There we go. There's the Schnapps. There's Ruby. This is actually my fiance. Her name is Ruby. That's how much I love Ruby. I also have a dachshund. His name is Hans Peter von Wolf V. It's a really long name because he's a really long dog. You might recognize me from such gems as Sextant. It's a way to see routes in your browser. It's also integrated already in Rails 4, so if you don't like running rake routes, which would mean that you're just a Rails developer, you should include the Sextant gem in your Rails 3 file. Also, I have Wicked. It's a step-by-step controller for building step-by-step wizards. And a little project called Code Triage, which allows anybody to kind of sign up and say, hey, I want to get involved, like, I don't know how. It just sends you one issue a day for, like, Rails, all that kind of stuff. So the real reason also, I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Texas, which is solely for the reason of I want to be able to say, good news, everyone, and, actually be able to say that. They give you a card, surprisingly enough, when you're a professor that allows you to say that. 40 hours of material, Schneems.com/UTRails. But the real reason I'm here to speak to you today is because I was a waiter for 3 years at Outback Steakhouse, which means that I know everything there is to know about Australia. Quick story, we had a gentleman from the UK who was another waiter. And once a customer comes up to the manager, it's like, oh, I've got a problem with your waiter. And he's like, what was wrong? Was the food okay? Was it not? Was he friendly? Was he not? And he's like, no, the guy had this horrible fake Australian accent the entire time. Like, it was just miserable. And he's like, no, he's from the UK. The customer would not believe him. So. Okay, but the real reason I'm here today to talk to you is because I'm from Heroku. Some of you might have heard of Heroku. Some of you might have heard something about routing, which I added an extra 10 minutes to the end of my my deck, and I'm going to be going through the first part of it a little bit quicker, just for you all. Australia Ruby exclusive. So we've got a little clicker. It's kind of so we've got over 2 million apps. I think maybe 3 million at this point in time. And if you deploy one application, you might say, all right, I really would like to do it better the next time. When you deploy 2 or 3, you get a kind of a sense of like, oh, okay, here's my pain points of administering and running. When you got like a couple million, some things become insanely painfully obvious. So our CTO compiled this list of 12 common things. You might have seen this before, the 12-factor app, and it's just like a, hey, if you're going to be building a framework, please, for the love of Pete, like do these 12 things, and you're going to be happy when you're running it. We're going to be happy when we are administering it. So, without further ado, we've got code-based dependencies, config, backend services, build, release, run, process, port binding, concurrency, disposability, dev prod, parity, logs, admin, processes, questions. Okay, so Rails gets a lot of the 12-factor right. And I don't really want to sit here and just read off a list of numbers. So instead, what I'm going to focus on is some areas in Rails that you as developers could be doing things a little bit differently. And so we're just going to skip the numbers and go straight to the takeaway. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. Only took me 4 minutes to actually start talking about something. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is security. Security is huge right now in Rails. This one, we're not going to be talking about the YAML vulnerability, so anyway, the first thing I want to talk about is CSRF. Anybody familiar with CSRF? Okay. Cross-site request forgery. This is one of the, before the YAML vulnerability, this was one of the big things that would come up relatively frequently. So just by default, anybody can kind of fake a request and say like, oh, I'm really from example.com when they're really not from example.com. And if we allow these people to send like posts or deletes or updates to our app, and we just go ahead and do whatever that post or update says, then that's pretty bad. So instead of doing that, we have a little public-private key kind of thing going on, where we put a public key into the browser, and then on every request, on every post or delete, we send that back over, and then the browser or Rails can go ahead and say, like, yes, this is an actual valid request or not. In order to set that, we have a config.security token. It's in an initializer somewhere. So this, this is, you don't want to show this to anybody, and that's kind of why I'm here. It is perhaps the key to your digital kingdom. So I just want to step back for a second, and rather than talking about Rails, let's think about something like personal and physical that you might own. Some people might not have cars here. I don't know how popular they are in Australia. It's just uncommon. Nobody has a car over there. So maybe apartment. But anyway, you wouldn't really want to give your key to maybe, like, would you give a copy to your intern and just be like, hey, you can use this whenever you want? Or like, a contractor or open source contributor, and just be like, hey, keys for everyone. Now, I mean, like, I got some pretty awesome open source contributors, especially if you're using codetriage.com. Sign up today. But they really are the keys to your digital kingdom. If you have these secrets and you're not changing them or rotating them in any way, shape, or form, then even if somebody only interned on your project for like, maybe like a couple of weeks, a day, then if they have your source code, they have all of those secrets. So you want to, of course, protect your code, and any kind of secure keys in source control just aren't secure, really. I mean, it's like hard-coded. It's like a freaking constant. So, what's an alternative? What's a good method that we can use to replace this kind of method of hard-coding our security keys? One thing that Heroku has proposed is using environment variables. If you're not familiar with environment variables, sorry, again, clicker. We use them all over the place inside of Rails. If you've ever run Readme migrate and you have the giant capital Rails ENV equals test, this is an example of an environment variable. If you take a look at the rubygems.org source code, you'll actually see that they are setting their config.secret token to an environment variable. So although you can right now, if you have internet, go ahead and download and pull that down, you can't forge a request to rubygems, though you might be able to get into it if you have an ill-crafted YAML file. But it's a way of, this token is going to be different on every single different machine. Did that make any sense? Okay, all right, I got you with me. I got some head nods. I got some couple people in the back sleeping. Okay. So in order to do this, we have to be able to use these environment variables not only in production but also in development. So a lot of people say, hey, how do I do that? I recommend using a .env file. And this file is going to just look like a set of keys and values. I think it just gets sourced, basically. So here we can set our secret token to whatever we want. And we're not limited to just secret token. We can also set Rails, ENV, or AWS credentials, anything like that. And then use a gem, such as the .env gem, which works with .env files. I know it's kind of difficult to wrap your brain around it. And what this will do is whenever you load it, it will go ahead and source that into your environment. So because we have our secret token in our .env file, now we've got it inside of our Ruby process. So that one's pretty easy. Also, Foreman gem, if you're used to using proc files and running things with proc files, Foreman already does this for you automatically. You can just do Foreman run, and if there's a .env file in the project, then it'll just go ahead and source it for you. One thing about .env, they also support multiple versions of env files. So like .env.test, .env.development, which is kind of cool if you need different credentials for that kind of thing. Of course, so once we got development down, you want to get it working into production. Of course, you could just add a config var in Heroku. I wouldn't be doing a very good job if I'm giving a what we learned from Heroku without a Heroku example. And this will be setting a configuration variable or an environment variable in your app. to persist, and you can have that, of course, have different variables in different applications. If you're using VPS, I'm not gonna discriminate. It's okay. You can use Foreman or .env in production. Either one of those. There's a slight cost on boot up, but that's pretty much it. Or you could add the variables directly to something that gets sourced on load up, something in your bash files. Or you could add your environment variables directly to the command. I don't really recommend that one. That would just get like really, really, really long. Okay. The next obvious question is, what if someone can read my environment variables? Well, if someone can read your environment variables, they can read your files too. And so storing your secrets in your source code isn't any better. Generally, somebody might come to me and say like, all right, well, you gave me one example of a secret token, but what else? What should I look for? And I would say just a good thought exercise is, can I open source my app today? Like, you know, I'm working for consultancy, I'm working for GitHub or Groupon or, you know, whatever. You know, if I hit that public button right now, would somebody be able to compromise my system, or would it be okay? So secret token is just one example of what we will call config. So it might be a good time to define config. We like to think of it as the things that will change in your app between deploys that don't necessarily actually require a deploy. These things are not code. So we've got resource strings to the database, credentials to S3. Those are, you know, freaking huge. Everybody uses S3. Canonical values and security tokens. So security token was one of them. In general, if you can change your S3 bucket by deploying, you know, you should be able to do that. But if you have to change, to deploy to change your S3 bucket, then that's not the greatest thing ever. You know, I've worked at a ton of companies, and we've had a bunch of files like this for development, where it's just like somebody's name, somebody's API token, somebody's secret, and it's just like on and on and on. And it's great for like 3 developers, but then you get 30 or 50 or like 80. And YAML files don't scale, as I guess we've seen multiple ways. So again, just use environment variables. If we do that, then we also get the ability to clearly define an interface between our platform and our code. So we have configuration and we have code, two very distinct things. And even if you like storing variables in Git, just like don't do it. It's kind of nasty. By doing this, we also get the benefit of being able to do a very detailed release management. So on Heroku, if you ever run Heroku releases against an app, this is my issue triage app, the same thing as codetriage.com, sign up now. You'll actually see whenever you add something to the configuration, it produces a separate release, because, you know, it's not, we're not only versioning our code, we're also versioning our configuration. So if somebody kind of bungles the S3 credentials, we want to know that, and we want to be able to roll back. So that's a good thing. You can just do rollback and to whatever version you want to roll back to. Keeping config separate from code also buys Heroku the unique ability to provide add-ons. If you ever used Heroku and used any of our add-ons, the interface is actually through environment variables. Maybe you're adding a MySQL or Redis, or you know, perhaps something along the names of CDN Sumo, which I may or may not be a developer on. So you can run Heroku add-ons, add CDN Sumo, and then in your app, all you have to do is add an environment variable, and then you're done. The add-on can go ahead and because it's not code, they can go ahead and toggle your environment variables and take control. So it's a really, really clean interface between your app. Also, side note, CDN Sumo is in beta. If you're using Heroku, go ahead and sign up. Try it now. It's a way to get a CDN really quick on your app. And again, I might be a developer on it. So, all right. So in this scenario, we're actually treating our add-ons as attached resources. We might see scenarios where somebody might want to use the same environment variables across different apps, and theoretically we could do that. But do note, if you're using that with an add-on, sometimes add-ons do expect to be able to change those environment variables. Okay. Anybody have any questions about config?
Is it common to have an example
Okay, the question was, is it common to have an example.m file? Yes, or I actually, and I'll get to this later, but I actually just like writing that to my README. If somebody needs to have an S3 set of credentials, then I actually tell them how to sign up for S3. Like, yeah. So that's a good idea. So how would you rotate the CRF token? I'm actually, you can just manually change the config bar in Heroku or change your .env file. Yeah, so Rails right now does not support having like 2 valid CRSF tokens, which would be great coming into the future, and I'd love to see that. If anybody wants to help me work on that or is working on that, let me know. Okay, well, I'm going to keep on going, and I think I have a little bit of time left over for questions. The next thing I want to talk about is development versus production. So we get Rails, we get the development environment, we get the production environment to test. All these things come for free. And so we like, initially you're just like, oh, hey, I can do whatever I want in development and whatever I want in production. And, you know, change code and do all these weird different configuration things. And then everybody's like, well, it worked in development, but it didn't in production, and I don't understand why. That's always like the #1, like, but it worked in development. So in general, like, if you're using Postgres in production, I would not recommend you to develop in Mongo. Like, you know, or just in general. Sorry. So similarly, like, it doesn't make any sense to use even something a little bit closer. So SQLite 3 might be a little bit closer to Postgres, but it's still different. Like, you're still going to run into issues. So you want to have what we like to call a dev prod parity. And this is where your development and your production machines are like as close as humanly possible. So things like same data stores, Postgres perhaps, same language versions, like Ruby 1.9, Ruby 2.0, you don't want to like deploy to Ruby 1.8.7 if you're like building on Ruby 2.0. I have actually seen some scenarios where people have deployed to JRuby and developed on MRI, but if you're going to do something like that, like run a CI server in your actual deployment language. Another one I'll add is actually real and consistent data, and this has been hugely successful to me in some of the companies I've worked for. If you're developing a new feature, you have all this UI, all this interaction, and if you build all of this feature around existing data and you end up faking the data in your development, it might show up weird or be kind of like just completely off. So I highly recommend you can take a snapshot of your database, you can pull it down if it's small enough. If not, then maybe you can just take a subset of your database, or I've built some scripts that use Factory Girl that will actually generate fake data, but consistent fake data across everyone's machine. So if somebody wants to tweak it, they can do that. In addition to developer production parity, something I actually add on is developer parity. So use a README to scale your developers, and this is kind of where I said I was going with the .env thing. There we go. I skipped ahead to the joke. There we go. Okay. So you want to treat your README like a living document. This is where you're going to be standardizing your developer environment. You should be able to give your project to anyone, and they should be able to get running. If they can't, hopefully it should be just only adding a couple of lines or modifying some things. So external dependencies, how do you start your app? Like, you know, these are kind of small things, but they can really vary from project to project. Even if you're like, oh, I'm not going to hire a contractor, I'm only the sole developer. Like, I have tried spinning up apps I wrote 5 years ago, and it just like doesn't work. I'm like, man, I really wish it's like writing a check to future you, or you know, it's even better if you do have other developers and do get these people, because then you really get to exercise this. So like, you know, everyone should have a README. There we go. So everyone should have a README, and you should take really, really good care of it. Whether you think you need it or not, you will thank me later. One common thing people will sometimes ask whenever I say that is like, oh, but like I'm a developer and I love scripting and automating things and I like hate like writing human words. Can I just use a script? And yeah, sure, you can use a script, but scripts break, and if somebody comes to me and they're like, hey, I failed on step 8 of this README where it says to do this, it's a lot easier than just if somebody's like, hey, your script failed. And I'm like, why? And they're like, because it didn't work. Did you try turning it off and on again? Okay, so that's all I have to say about Parity. The next thing I want to talk about relatively quickly is application health. My health as well. My throat's kind of going as I'm talking. Can you all still hear me okay in the back? Yep. All right. I'm generally a loud person, so it helps. So you know when you're sick, but you also need to have ways to keep tabs on your application. The number one way, of course, is logs. That's like one of the first things you ever do as a Rails developer. Like you spin up your server, and then like you see logs, and you see a failure, and it's like this giant, horrible, something goes wrong, and the error is presented right to you. But when you actually deploy to production, it's not quite as obvious how to always get to your logs. Of course, in VPS, you would just tail inside of Heroku. You can run. There we go. Heroku logs tail. In addition to this, if you're, hopefully you're doing this, or you're looking at your logs occasionally, maybe getting some feedback from users. In addition to this, I highly recommend using some sort of a persistent logging service, such as Papertrail. So Papertrail, you can hook it up to your app, and it looks just kind of like this. It just kind of looks like logs, except for you can search it and it archives them. So it's just like grepping through your logs, but it's way better because it's software as a service, and like those are awesome. So highly recommend using Papertrail, or there's a couple other competitive services like that. I think they have an add-on. In addition to that, error notification is really helpful, especially if you have a relatively small app or you're just getting started. A couple of those, we got New Relic, we have Airbreak, and Honeybadger. Fun, if you actually look in the README for Honeybadger, it's like, hey, thanks Airbreak, we just stole your code because it's MIT licensed. It's all good. And if you're using these, so New Relic actually does a lot more than just this kind of error tracking and logging. We can do some performance measuring things, which we'll actually maybe touch on a little bit later when we get into routing. Hopefully you're all sticking around for. So a pro tip of all of the apps I've ever worked on that I like freaking love is admin flavored error pages. So everybody has a cute little like 404 page. This is actually my fiance's. She runs a service called Our School, and if you type in like a bad URL, like this is what you get. Like you get a cute little monster and whatever. Instead of having this as a static page though, instead of just a 404.html, it's actually hitting a Rails controller and running like like 404.html.erb. Actually, I don't think it'd be called 404, but I forget the name. Anyway, if you were logged in and you have an admin flag toggled on your user, instead of just seeing the splash page, you actually get the splash page plus a backtrace, any kind of error message, and all of the details, the params. So rather than actually having to go and be like, if you're an admin, you're on the site, you hit an error, rather than actually having to go to like hunt down that error, especially if you're in a huge system where you've got hopefully thousands and millions of users and tons of requests per second, here just right in front of you, right in your face. Highly recommend this, though if you're doing it, try to keep this code as simple as possible, because if you have an error on the error page, there's no error page for that. Okay, so that's really what I what I wanted to talk about in terms of what we've learned and some of the bulk of the lessons learned. I do have a section of routing, so stay tuned. But before we get into that, I just wanted to say that now that Heroku also supports a whole nother level of languages and frameworks, like we see a ton of people who are just like basically imitating Rails. Like we've got Cake. Well, this is my opinion. It's not Heroku's opinion. We've got like Cake PHP. We've got the Play framework for Java. We've got Django, and even if they're not directly, like, actually physically imitating, a lot of people will come to them and they will say, well, oh, Rails does it like this, or like this isn't how Rails implements it, or you know, like when it comes to like CSRF and they say, oh, we need to solve this, you want to take a look at the existing solutions out there. So, not, you know, if we can develop some of these patterns, it was brought up previously, like, hey, how can we safely rotate that key? That's a really good question, and like we should solve that, we should figure that out, and then like we should get that into Rails. And whenever we do that, not only are we helping us, we're helping everyone who comes after us, and all these other languages and all these other frameworks. So that's something to consider. So Rails can still be better. If you are interested in helping out with Rails, you can go to codetriage.com and sign up to triage Rails issues. All right, so this is like my bonus section. Does anybody know what routing is? Okay, somebody told me to call this section Routergate. I might attribute that to Terrence Lee. Standing right here. So we're going to start out relatively simple, like just generally what is routing. This is a short section. You can take a quick nap if you already know what routing is. The super crazy simplified view of our system looks kind of like this. On the top, you've got multiple dynos. In the middle section, we've got our routing cluster, and yes, this is an actual cluster of machines. Heroku is pro scaling things horizontally and not like scaling things vertically. And then at the bottom, we have a request represented by an arrow. So what happens is a request will come into the routing cluster, and the routing cluster will kick it over to a machine, to a dyno. And then that dyno will work on it for a little bit, and then while it's working, maybe another request will come in. That one's working, and you know, kind of that one's working. You kind of get the gist. Like the router routes requests, or for those people from Australia, I'm actually talking about the router. I was told maybe people wouldn't understand. Of course, whenever one of these machines gets done with the request, it will then return a response, and that will get kicked back to the user, and then that machine is free to take another request. Okay? Sound good? Not too bad. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is no friction intelligent routing. This is living in a 100% like perfect world with zero kind of crosstalk or zero network latencies between machines, because we are talking about a distributed routing system. In this ideal world, we would route requests only to free dynos. So whenever if a request has is busy, then we route it to another machine that is not busy. It makes sense, right? Like, why would you route like 10 to one machine that's busy and then like none to a machine that's not busy? So this works really, really well if each machine only handles one request at a time, and we know that. If the router says like, you are Rails and you are running thin, and I know for a fact you can only take one request at a time, because then it just like it only sends one at a time. Unfortunately, that breaks down, or that assumption breaks down whenever you start to worry about concurrent requests and languages or frameworks like Node.js, where you say, oh, we want to take 100 or 1,000 concurrent requests to the exact same machine, and we can do that because we're built to do that. So rather than doing that, there's another way, which is actually implemented on Cedar. Okay, so that's kind of the primer. The issue that you might have heard of in the news is if you've got multiple dynos and you have huge request variance. So some requests come back super quick in a millisecond, whatever super quick means to you, and then some of them take like 10 seconds, 20 seconds. We do kill off requests at 30 seconds, but if you have that large disparity, then what can actually happen is if you're sending multiple requests to a fleet of dynos and we don't know for a fact that you're single-threaded, we actually want to send multiple. Even if you're busy, even if you're working on something, you might be able to handle additional connections. So connections can back up, and you can have a short running response or short running request queued up after a long running request, and so that's not ideal. That's not good. So we have a customer who has published a large amount of information on this, which is actually kind of cool. Very high traffic customer, and on the bottom, this graph that kind of just like drops to the bottom and then cuts over. This is what it looks like if we were to have absolute, like, no friction intelligent routing. And you can see basically what it's saying is at about like 75 dynos or so, that's when we cut to there's 0% of any request either waiting in the dyno level or on the router level, and we can queue on both of those levels. So that would be for 100% ideal purposes. Unfortunately, in the real world, we do have friction that does exist in distributed systems. So instead of using the 100% intelligent router that that graph represents that doesn't actually exist, we use a variant of round-robin routing. So this is a routing pattern you might have encountered in Amazon ELB, Nginx, or pretty much everywhere. And basically, it just says like we're gonna send. We use a variant of it, but it says we're gonna send a request to each one of our dynos in succession, and we're gonna kind of assume that the average of requests is going to be about the same. And this actually works really well if you are running multiple backends. If you're running something like Node.js, or you're running a multi-threaded server, which I'll get to and touch on in just a second. Unfortunately, if you're not, if you are just running single-threaded, then your response is horrible, like absolutely appalling. This is a graph of what the round-robin would look like with just one thread. So, you know, here rather than just saying like 99 dynos or 75 dynos and I guess sorry, we've got percent of requests queued on one side, and on the bottom we've got the number of dynos. So in this case, lower is better. Lower is always better. Here, we're not even like tending to 0. Like that's disgusting. That's horrible. So can we improve this number? Like, if as developers, like you don't want that, I don't want that. Instead, one thing that we can do today is use a concurrent server. If you do that, it is a zillion times better than the worst case scenario. And sure, it does not, you'll notice that it does not 100% perfectly follow the perfect ideal no friction curve. But there is actually an inflection point. Before this inflection point, we're better than the ideal router, which is kind of interesting, I thought. And it does tend towards 0. So these are all ideal things. I mentioned the Cedar does use a variation of round robin. If anybody's using Bamboo, that was actually where the issue came up on. I can talk to you personally. I don't have enough time to go into exactly why a variant of this issue was seen on Bamboo. But the too long didn't read is you should use concurrent servers. If you're deploying on Heroku, use Unicorn, use Puma. Probably going to mispronounce this, Puma. Somebody said that to me, and I was like, what is that word you're using? They were like, Puma. You know, when you do this, your performance it's increased dramatically. So yeah, don't use single-threaded servers unless you really have to. And it's also each dyno. If you didn't know this, it's 512 megabytes of RAM. And if you're only using a single thread, a single process, you're probably not using all of your capacity. Whenever you use concurrent servers, you can get more of that capacity. So like you get more bang for your buck anyway. So I don't understand why you wouldn't use a concurrent server. Also, we JRuby running on Heroku now. If any JRuby fans. And we're looking in ways to improve that worst case scenario for Heroku. How those, if you do want to run a single threaded app and you are relying a little bit more on our routing than on having these multiple backends. And right now, I can tell you, we've got some changes. We recently have been working with New Relic to get some more visibility into exactly how our system works, and we do have a bunch more visibility coming out on this on blog.heroku.com, which will kind of help you stay updated, and we'll let you know in terms of if we do find a optimal solution that works for say 90 to 99% use case of our users. We don't want to, like when you're running close to 3 million applications, you can't just say like, oh, we're just going to ignore these guys and just like plan against this. Those guys are edge cases. So also, I'm going to be around the conference if you have any questions about this. Hopefully, this was just intended to kind of be a rough primer on what has gone down and what you can do to mitigate it. I've gotten a ton of questions about routing. I did want to say, vote for Terrence Lee for Ruby Heroes 2013. That is actually the entire reason I came to give this talk. He's standing right here, the maintainer of Bundler. Ask not what Bundler can do for you, but what you can do for your Bundler maintainer. Terrence Lee, ladies and gentlemen. Also, he's talking later on, believe it or not, Bundler. All right, do I have time for questions? Okay, I got 5 minutes. Ask me any non-routing related questions. Or you can ask me routing questions, that's fine too. Yes?
Those 12 points you skipped over fairly rapidly at the start. Are they up
Yes, so 12factor.net for those 12 points. And you'll actually find that Rails does adhere to like most of them. So, yes?
How do they generate the benchmarks of the number of dynos? I mean, if you just want to do a test, you don't want to change like 400 dynos or whatever. Is there some way to do that without cost?
Yeah, so the question was, can we do a test without actually incurring cost against dynos? I think what they did is they just measured existing traffic on their existing app, like how requests came in, and then they did something crazy. They generated that graph in R, I think, like using statistics or other voodoo that I don't understand.
Someone made a closure library that is for modeling networks and routing, and you can put in latency. It's really cool.
Yeah, and this is a rapidly evolving situation. Chris, did you?
Full disclosure, I work for New Relic, but New Relic, there's a capacity report that models as your throughput goes up, how your performance goes, so you can see as you increase the number of requests, what your application is expecting to do.
Yeah, so New Relic will help you out. They got your back.
And you can get the standard for free on Heroku, so.
And you can get the standard for free on Heroku. Sign up now. Also, one thing I did want to mention is that error, that issue, does depend largely on your app. Not most, a lot of apps don't have that much request variance. Like generally, requests take about the same amount of time. And so this is a very personal thing to your app. It doesn't mean that 100% like guaranteed you are seeing this. Also, if you're seeing H12s, that's probably not because of this issue. You can come talk to me later.
You talked about storing your config in the environment variables, and then you talked about version, like you could roll back to Heroku and versioning it. How do you version them?
How do we version them?
Well, how should we?
So one thing I've actually seen is having a private Git repo for, did everybody hear the question? Okay. Having a private Git repo for your own config credentials, and then you could just roll back to a different commit, and then doing something like with Capistrano, something along the lines of it, you automatically pull down those environment variables and then you push it up. So that's one option. I've also heard of other like crazy options where people have like encrypted private like stuff where it's like layers of secrecy. You can go real like crazy with that stuff.
Quick question on the queuing.
Yes.
Suppose I only one diode.
Yes.
And actually if I was trying to fix on a Heroku and after the third concurrent request without time now. So is there, you said it's about 30-second time out per request. But if I request a return quickly, how many concurrent requests I can queue?
How many concurrent requests will queue on Heroku? I don't know. A lot.
Rather, when would you get It?
As Heroku, when will we drop requests? We don't. After After that request is waited in the queue for 30 seconds with no response from your app, then we'll come back and we'll be like, yo, this guy didn't like give us any response. Also, by the way, that 30 seconds, we don't tell your app when that 30 seconds is up. If you have a request that takes 5 minutes, we're going to kill it after 30 seconds, but your app isn't going to know. It's still going to keep processing that request for another 4 minutes and 30 seconds, holding up that dyno. So we do recommend using something along the lines of rack timeout if you do have these potential long requests that are running. And rack timeout, you can set it to 30 seconds, and that will actually kill the request. Did that answer your question? Kind of. Okay. Yeah. If you have more questions, I'm the guy wearing the purple shirt. One more question. Come on down. Bonus points if it's about my dog.
We should all be using
So the question, I actually didn't entirely hear, but I think it's why doesn't our docs tell you to use Unicorn, basically?
Well, why, like, I understand if I just deploy an app, whatever, it's going to use Thin.
If you deploy an app right now, just whatever, it's not going to use Thin, because Thin isn't bundled in your gem file. It'll use WebRick, which is like a million times worse. So at the end of the day, you probably, as a developer, want to. Each app's going to behave a little bit differently. We're working on maybe some documentation with Unicorn and Puma. Unfortunately, though, neither one of those just like 100% like perfectly works out of the box for like everybody. Like there's like with Unicorn, there's some like signal handling weirdness that they do, and there's some other like binding the port. Like it takes a really long time to bind to the port, and like you'll get application errors even if your application's working for like the first couple of requests. But like if you're interested in using Unicorn, or you are using Unicorn and you've seen like really weird things happen, like I could probably answer your questions. But that's definitely something we're interested in getting a little bit more like push towards. Like, hey, use these concurrent servers, but also the concurrent servers aren't quite there in terms of like just being ready to go out of the box. So yeah, just a heads up, it might take a little bit of trial and error to get some configuration right on those. All right. You're welcome. If anybody's interested.